Hi, friends! Welcome to another episode of Getting Bookish. This is where we talk about our favorite thing, reading. This week, Shawna and I are super excited because my friend Camille Rhoades is here with us. Yay! um, Camille and I met during our undergrad at Colorado Mesa University. But I think that our friendship really was cemented when we realized that we liked to read a lot of the same kind of books. And so if you go through like our text messages or any of our chatting back and forth, it's like 90% talking about what we're reading and 10% talking about life. So
Isn't reading life?
Yeah, it is. Reading is the best part of my life sometimes. A lot of times, most of the time. Um, and I'm excited because we're actually going to talk about something today that Camille and I don't really have in common, and that's reading science fiction. Because I don't read a lot of science fiction or any science fiction. Shawna is shaking her head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not
Or
my
so
area
you think.
of expertise.
So, Camille, I would love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners and let us know a little bit about you.
Well, hi, I'm Camille. And I have two kids. They are 6 and 3, and I like to say they're the light of my life. And I also want to murder them most of the time. But it's okay because I love them anyway. And yeah, I just love to read. I read a lot of audiobooks, because my commute is crazy long. I drive 35 minutes one way to work, and I live in Colorado Springs, so it's a pretty big area anyway. But yeah, I just love to read.
Now, you guys had mentioned your undergrad. What was that in? Like, what is your schooling here? Not that it, like, matters, but people might wonder.
I know in psychology, and Liz double majored in English and psychology, so that's where we met in our psych classes and psych club.
Oh,
okay.
And,
yeah, and then I have my master's in psychology, too, so I'm studying to become a therapist.
Oh, interesting. I thought you both were, like, literary nerd school people. And I mean nerd in the most loving term
right.
ever.
I would never take
that. Actually
term.
reminds me that we would be sitting together, Camille and some of our other friends and I, and like someone from the English department would come over and like talk to me about something, and like we'd have like this quick kind of crazy conversation about whatever it was we were reading, and they'd walk away and all of my psychology department friends would be like, what kind of nerd are you? Like,
I love it.
So back in those days, they were like, that was like real deep and real weird. Like
who uses prose in a sentence?
Right.
Did you just speak to her entirely in haiku?
Yeah, right.
Not that bad.
It wasn't that bad, but it was pretty funny. But we had a lot of fun in our psych club days, and yeah. So this is my favorite question to ask people because I'm always nosy. I was going to say curious, but really it's just that I'm nosy. Yeah. What are you reading right now?
I just finished Dark Dawn by Jay Kristoff, which is the third and final one in the Nevernight series.
I haven't started
it was yet. Amazing. It was amazing. And I'm currently reading. So I listened to that one. So I'm rereading, not rereading, first time reading, Surfacing by Margaret Atwood. And I'm like 10% in, and I still have no idea what this book is about. It's not one I would recommend so far. Oh, well.
Do you like her books?
Yes and no. So okay. I usually like her short stories. So she has a collection of short stories, and they're really good. I liked The Handmaid's Tale, and I read, well, I listened to all of the Oryx and I don't remember the other word series, and it's like 3-4 books, and I'm like, I don't even know why I'm reading this. It just makes me feel icky. So
Oh.
a lot of her writing makes you feel icky.
That's how I felt during Handmaid's Tale, because I just read it. Like, I just finished it. And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
It's one of those.
I think that's what she likes to do.
Yeah.
It's like she likes to make you feel awful about yourself.
Well, she did a great job.
Right.
Agreed.
She's fabulous at it.
Yes.
So do you think you'll finish it, or are you kind of ready to give it up?
Well, my coworker was like, have you read it yet? Have you read it yet? So I will probably read it because she has been asking about it. But I hope that at some point I'm like, oh, this is why she wanted me to read it and not just because she remembers it.
Maybe.
From college. I don't remember. I wonder if she like even remembers why she likes it.
So do you have any reading goals that you set up for yourself for the year or month, or what are those?
Well, so I always do the Goodreads, like I'm going to read this many. Mm-hmm. And I set it at 50, which was way too low because I'm already at 65.
Wow, that feels awesome though, I bet.
I'm like, yay. But I really wanted to read more diverse authors this year, especially women of color, just to, expand my horizons. I feel like I've been wanting to consume a lot more diverse media anyway, and books is the best way to do that. So one of my favorite Black female authors is N.K. Jemisin, and she writes a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. So she's amazing. I have like 6 more books of hers on my list that I want to read, but I started out with How Long Until Black Future Month, which is a collection of her short stories, which is pretty cool.
I don't know, about a month ago, like right after you had met your reading goal, and you were like, oh, now I can just reread books for the rest of the year, like reread my favorites. And I'm like, oh man, I wish I had read my reading goal already so I could.
We have to lower our goal next time, Liz, so that we can
I know.
Have fun.
I was like, maybe I should break it up, like, right, because 100 books. Shawna and I both set our goal at 100 books for the year.
A lot.
And yeah, I'm like, maybe next year I should say I want to read like 60 new titles and then reread 40 titles, because it might be interesting even to reread like some classics, like things that I read in college or things that I read in high school. So that might be like a different kind of goal. I don't know. I just made it up right now, but it might be fun.
No, I like that because it's a little bit more specific. You could read 100 books, but 60 of them have to be new titles. I like that because then that gives you more flexibility to be like, because when you, like, I think on our last, or our August bookish brief, you had said, okay, and my last 2 books were rereads of The Raven King or whatever it was. And I mean, they still count, but I'm like, you really
I've never
read the same book twice in the month?
Yeah, in the month.
We both did twice in a row.
That's hilarious.
Bad.
Yeah. If you haven't read it, you don't get it.
For real. Or if you read it and you're like,
now, on Goodreads, are you really a dedicated Goodreads? Like, do you write little like reviews throughout reading the book, or do you write reviews at the end, or do you just put them up saying you're reading and I finished?
I usually do updates. I don't always comment on it, but I normally do at least like a paragraph review at the end. I very rarely do all-out reviews like I know Liz does. I haven't been on yours very much yet, Shawna, but but I usually do like a little paragraph, especially if it was, and I notate if it's audio or ebook or if it was a physical book. Okay. I don't know why.
Oh, that's smart to do. I could do a shelf for that. I need to do a shelf. You probably already have shelves like that, Liz.
Oh, really? I don't.
What? I do.
You're so organized.
But I can't say I have kept up on it altogether. But it's nice to know when you go back later and you're like, oh yeah, I listened to that. When I'm like, why can't I think of what the cover of that book looks like?
Yeah.
Well, it's because I never held the book in my hand, so I don't know what the cover of the book looks like. Yeah. So now I know we like to read a lot of the same books, but I'm curious, can you tell us 3 favorites, like 3 recommendations for us, and then make an unrecommendation, something we should avoid reading at all costs?
Oh.
I know, it's that question.
But I have, so I'm going to give you 4 books as my recommended.
Okay.
Just because one of them is totally not appropriate for younger readers. It's a very adult book. It was written in the 60s, so that tells you something. So all of my recommendations are going to be in the sci-fi genre. Just, stick with the theme. So Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow are like 2 sides of the same story by Orson Scott Card. And I always feel bad recommending these in front of Liz because I know that she did not like Ender's Game at all. And I'm like, it was so good. So it's okay, I'll live. But we do have book disagreements from time to time, and they're not all on sci-fi. And then the Stormlight Archive, which is a series. It starts out with Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. And that's more of like a cross genre because it has some fantasy elements to it too. But I really, really like it. And those are huge books, like 700 to 1,000 pages each. And Dune by Frank Herbert, which is a classic sci-fi. And then Up the Line by Robert Silverberg is the not so kid-friendly one. That one's about time travel. It's a lot of fun.
Okay. I do like books on time travel. Like, Outlander.
Hey, there you go. There you go. See, you do read sci-fi. My unrecommendation would be Mia 2.0 by Deborah Drizza. I DNF'd it at 30%, and I'm like, I don't care about these characters.
Isn't that the one you read, Liz?
I have read about as much as Camille has.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was a while ago.
I just every character interaction, I was just rolling my eyes, and I'm like, I just don't care. Everyone just shows so shallow, and like characters should not just be like background objects to drive the story. It's like they need to be a big part of it too for me.
What is your favorite type of book to read? Genre, or even more specific than that?
I really, I love sci-fi, I love fantasy, and I really like YA books because they are so character driven. So I know later you guys will probably ask me what my favorite thing is, and I'm going to say character development. With some explanations. Just because like they have so much conversational snark in there, and it makes me laugh even if it's a very serious topic, and it's just great. And there's so much that can happen in a YA book.
Now, what is it about sci-fi that you like? Because this is really hard for me to grasp.
Well,
break it down.
Sci-fi is like, when I say sci-fi, what do you think of automatically?
I think of like robots and like Terminator and these broken down dystopian worlds or something, or space.
Star Trek.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like any of those things.
Like, I don't know, things that my husband reads, kind of like time warps, and I don't know. So that's where I am with sci-fi.
Yeah, I think of like space and aliens.
Computers.
A lot of aliens.
A lot of aliens, yeah. So I asked a lot of my coworkers at work in prep for this. I'm like, how would you define sci-fi? And they're like, I don't know, space travel and aliens. And I'm like, okay. And I think I asked like 10 or 11 of them. And that's basically what all of them said. So I think that that's probably the biggest part of it is like there's so many subgenres of sci-fi where it's not just about those things. There's like so many other things. Even A Handmaid's Tale is considered sci-fi.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
It's I think I can't remember what it is. Speculative, I think. I have it in here. Yes, Slipstream, which is speculative content. Because we don't know what happened to like plummet the fertility rate in this near future to lead to these like systematic enslavement and unfortunately rape of fertile women. So it's kind of like this weird thing happened that has some sort of scientific basis, but we don't talk about that at all. We talk about the repercussions of it. So it's still a type of sci-fi.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so there you go. You've read a sci-fi book recently.
So that's really interesting. So, okay, so you had your coworkers like kind of give definitions. Is there like a definition, a science fiction that you use or that you like?
So I was, when I was reading to prep, I saw something from Rod Serling, who is the narrator for The Twilight Zone. In one of the episodes, he says, I'm paraphrasing, basically sci-fi is the improbable made possible, where fantasy is the impossible made probable. Ooh. So it's more, and then another article that I read, the authors on there were saying it's like if something is done through psychic power, then that's considered sci-fi. If it's magic, then that's fantasy. So it's very fine line, and they often cross. So I think we read a lot more of the mix of sci-fi and fantasy, which is why in the library they're generally lumped together.
So does that mean that your Raven books are sci-fi?
I would say they're more fantasy because it's more the magical realism. And I think it is more magic rather than a scientific basis. I don't know.
Even though there are psychics.
That's
right.
The word
that's very interesting, though.
Yeah, because they use like the power of the ley line to make things louder.
Oh, okay.
So I think it comes from something external and is channeled through them.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Ooh, but some could argue that it could be sci-fi.
Maybe. Yeah, you could.
Right.
Ooh.
Or at least that like cross genre.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Now I do know that this book is probably in the genre of sci-fi, and I really enjoyed it. Was Hunger Games, and that whole entire series. Like I was totally in it. Like I absolutely love that.
Are dystopian books, is that a sci-fi genre, like subgenre?
Yes. So that, according to this article I read, there are 13.
I feel like my mind is going like this right now.
And that was one of them. So it's like the apocalyptic, kind of Holocaust, dystopian type of things, like Hunger Games. There's also like 1984 by George Orwell and Logan's Run by William F. Nolan. Those would be in that subgenre. As they're just so cool. Do you want me to tell you all the subgenres?
Yes, because I feel like in my mind, science fiction was this very small thing that I was like, I don't like those books.
Like, no, you don't like the space travel books, which is why you don't like it.
I think that's what it is I don't like space travel because it feels, I don't know, cold. I don't connect with it very well. I don't know what it is.
You know what? I'm wondering if it's like, if you have a bad experience with a book, if you're like, okay, what genre is this? Okay, I don't like that. Because that's what I did with Blake Crouch. I was like, what is this?
He's a hard sci-fi writer.
Yeah, it was dark matter. And
which I love.
That's my number one loathed book of all time. And
her own recommendation.
I was so angry. It still angers me. Like, what's wrong with me? But I was like, what is this? I'm like, oh, it's sci-fi. That's why. And like, I put it aside. But Liz, what if somebody who has never read fantasy, right? What if they picked up Damsel and they read it and they were like, what is this? Oh, it's fantasy?
Garbage.
I'm never reading this again. I wonder if it's something like that. You have this terrible experience and you're like, that must be what it's all like.
Right. I bet it is, because I think about like I'm always like, I don't read romance, because in my mind, I don't read romance, because I read a romance book one time and it was very derivative and I didn't enjoy it. And so now I'm like, I don't read romance, except for a lot of the books I read. Romance is a very heavy part of the storyline. And I'm like, I think I actually do read romance.
Yeah.
I just don't read books that are
a subplot.
I think you should say Harlequin romance.
Right. I think that's what it is I don't read those. Like, I had a coworker that referred to them as bodice rippers. I don't read that kind of romance, which is probably right. Which is probably a subplot. So I'm curious, how many how many subgenres are there in science fiction?
There are 13. So there's that apocalyptic and dystopian. There's cross genre, which is usually with fantasy, because they're so connected. So an example of that would be Way of Kings. Cyberpunk is one, like Cinder series by Marissa Meyer, which I know Liz loves. So have you read those, Shawna?
I haven't. I have the book, but I'm on the fence of whether I want to read it or not.
It's the sci-fi piece of it is very small in comparison to like just the retelling. It's really interesting though. I think you would like it. Yeah. And then Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve is another example of cyberpunk, and I did not like that book, but some people do. Like, First Contact. The First Contact is one where it's like the first time the characters make contact with an alien race. A lot of Frederick Pohl's work is around that. I can't think of anything specific, but a lot of his work is like that. Like Stranger in a Strange Land is like that too. So then there's the hard sci-fi like Dark Matter, which is like I like the thought experiment behind that, but I'm like, I don't think that, like, he could have made that a little bit more approachable.
That's such a political way to review a book. He could have made that more approachable.
And a lot of the hard sci-fi is like probably the least accessible part of the sci-fi genre. And they are very like math and science heavy, and it explains it in the text.
Yes, maybe that's what it was.
I don't really care that part.
I am not a math person at all. And then when he was talking about going from like, world to world, or like time to time, and then there were so many, and I was like, I can't. I'm doing homework while I'm reading this book. Like, I can't do this anymore.
How I felt about the Cryptonomicon by Neil Stevenson. I was like, I can't. I DNF'd that one.
Right?
Yeah.
Can't even say that.
I'm not even sure if that one's sci-fi, but it is very math heavy. Like, math lit. Like, no, thank you. Then there's the humorous sci-fi, which I think the most well-known one of that one is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Like, everyone knows that one because it's more like the silly aspects of it, and it's just more fun. Discworld by Terry Pratchett is also kind of the same there. The military and sci-fi combat aspect, like the Illuminae series by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, and those are amazing.
They are.
Liz told me that the actual physical books are really awesome too, but I listen to them and they're read by a full cast, and it was really good. So
I listened also, but we have them at the bookstore, and
you got this.
they're so cool to look at. And I think that, like, if you have a teenage boy in your life that doesn't really like to read, these are very approachable because they're very kind of graphic heavy, and the text is set up in all different ways. Like sometimes it looks like a case file, and sometimes it looks like a computer readout, and sometimes it looks like you're in the Matrix. Like, and so it's really they're cool. Really cool the way their whole book is set up.
So Liz, since you read and listened, what would you recommend
for the Illuminae?
Yeah.
I would, like, if I was recommending it to you, Shawna, yeah. I would say listen, because it's full cast and like there's sound effects and everything. It's like listening to a movie. It's
really cool.
I would absolutely listen. But if I was recommending it to a 15-year-old boy
then read it.
Yeah, then I would say read it, because I don't think that teenagers oftentimes connect very well with audio, but
they don't listen.
Right. Right. I hadn't even put two and two together too. There, but yeah, because I don't think that you would get a lot. I mean, you would find the way it's set up interesting, but it wouldn't necessarily, like lend a lot to the story, whereas the full cast is amazing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do like epistolary novels. So novels told like through letters. So
right, and
if it
these
has
are kind
that
of like
letter
that
look, that's really like eye candy to me. So
right, and these are kind of like that because it's gathering, like it's telling one story through the gathering of like all different like reports, like diary entries and files and like an audio recording of something. And so it's all these different like pieces come together to tell one narrative.
And it's sci-fi.
Yeah.
And it's sci-fi, which I guess I would have classified it as that.
Mm-hmm.
If asked, but I would have also said I hadn't read any science fiction books this year. So yeah.
Like, I classify that more as YA.
Yes. YA is not actually a genre. Oh, yeah.
Right. And one I just finished, too, that would also fall into that is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. And I read that one, and I'm like, I don't know if I like this so much until, like, I was almost 20% through. And I'm like, I love Brandon Sanderson so much. He's one of my favorite authors. So it turns out really well. I like it a lot. But at first, I'm like, I really hate this main character.
Well, that makes it so hard to read a book.
Yeah. And it's told in first person. And I know that Liz has said before, like, that she does not like the first person perspective. And I agree with that. And he typically writes in third person, so it was really strange.
Yeah. Did that bother you in Twilight then?
For me?
Yeah. She tells it in first person.
I don't know if when I read Twilight, if I was a mature enough reader to know that that was what I didn't like. Like, that makes me not connect very well. But I think that Twilight is a good example of why I don't like it, because first person is so often used as like emotional shorthand, because they can use that I voice. I feel sad. I feel hurt. Yeah. So rather than the author having to describe what it looks like for that person to feel sad or be hurt, they just get to use the I voice saying, this thing happened and now I'm sad, which obviously that's not a quote that any book has used. But maybe a picture book about emotions, but but I think that that's what I love about third person, is that there's so much more goes into describing those emotions, which is what I read books for. I would just read books about how people feel about things.
I wonder if that's kind of why you're not a big reader of memoirs.
Oh, I had not thought of that, but I bet it is because they're first person.
Yeah. I mean, even though it is their story, so they get to tell it however they want, but as a listener, maybe that's something that's off-putting.
Maybe. Because I do like biographies.
Oh, yeah, but that's
written about other people.
Biography that's Shawna, you may have solved a reading mystery.
Like an onion, peeling the layers.
Yes, I love it.
That's so cool. I didn't even think about that.
No.
Anyway.
I'm fascinated.
I know. So some of the others are like, anyway, diving back in.
Yes.
There's also a near future sci-fi. So I think virtual reality is a big one in that one. Like Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, or City of Golden Shadow by Tad Williams. They're both set in a VR world, and they're very interesting. Ready Player One is great in audio too, because it's read by Will Wheaton, and
I love
hilarious.
him. He is amazing. He's an
good.
Amazing narrator.
Yes.
Absolutely
I
fantastic.
haven't ever listened to anything that he's narrated.
Oh, he's fantastic.
I mean, obviously he's great, but...
Yeah, I actually have that book, and I knew it was sci-fi, but I'm a huge gamer nerd, which is weird because I play a bunch of gamer sci-fi nerd games. So I have that book. I just haven't read it yet, and when I found out he was a narrator, I'm like, do I want to read it? I mean, I bought it, but he's reading it. Like, maybe I'll just listen, or maybe I'll do both. I don't know. So,
we'll see. He's a great narrator. So the sci-fi, like future fantasy is, so it's not always like based in science, but it has like very little explanation of the scientific principles that are going on. But it's like, yes, this is definitely sci-fi, like Dune by Frank Herbert, or Crystal Singer by Anne McCaffrey. So that's part of a trilogy and that I really enjoyed. I think that was probably my first sci-fi book, and I read it in high school. It was fantastic. Then there's the slipstream, so like we talked about earlier with The Handmaid's Tale being that speculative fiction. The soft sci-fi, and like sometimes called sociological sci-fi, is like very character driven. So The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers is a really good example of that one. And I read a comment online that someone's like, oh, that's like Tumblr meets sci-fi, which I totally agree with. I'm like, okay, yeah, I could see that because there's so much like forward thinking and progressive thinking on Tumblr, and it kind of goes into this book. The Hunger Games would fall into that one too, I think, with the sociological principles behind it, and Logan's Run. Then space opera, which I think is what a lot of people think of too, with yes, that face is exactly
space opera.
Like, what the heck? So the biggest example of that in media would be like Star Wars.
Yeah.
So it's like a Western in space. Firefly, that type of stuff. It's very...
I do have to pull back on Firefly, though. That is my husband. It's like, I can't talk to him about it because he's so hurt by its disappearance. We can't even talk about it. I've never watched it, but I can't even talk to him about it because he's so upset. He's so upset. He's still upset.
It's so good.
I could go get him right now and he would just be upset and I'd ruin his night by talking about the disappearance of Firefly.
I love, and this is such a Tumblr thing even to bring up, but whenever someone's talking about some kind of injustice that's been done to them and some nerd in the comments will be like, yeah, well, I'm never getting a second season of Firefly. So,
That's the end all.
Right. You think your problems are bad. All I got was this movie and it didn't really fill the void.
Right. I totally love Serenity too, though. It's really good.
No, I do like Serenity, but it didn't. There's still a void. The movie's good. There's still a void. Mm-hmm. They could bring it back.
They could.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Moving on. And Treason by Orson Scott Card is another one like that too. And what's interesting about that one is that Treason is the name of a planet that like the space traveling people used to send all of their criminals to. So it's like future Australia.
Right.
That's how Australia got populated by who were not Aboriginals. So yeah, so that one was pretty interesting. And then time travel, of course. So like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which is such a classic. It was published in the 1880s, and it's still like an accessible book today. The Wells Bequest, which is interesting because it kind of Liz.
I know, I love that
one. The second in a series by Polly Shulman. The first one is The Grim Legacy, and you really have to read the first one first, even though the stories are totally separate, just so you get an idea of the world. But it's like this repository of items and books and things in New York, and they have specific collections, and the Wells Bequest has like time travel stuff in it, and named after H.G. Wells, and it's very interesting. And then like Up the Line would fall in there too. So there's my.
And the fun thing about the Wells Bequest and the Grim Legacy is they're actually children's books, but
I would guess middle grade.
They're middle grade, and
they're like, guessing.
Right, I know, which is how the kind of the two main characters are like, wait, but it's such a fantastic notion that there's like this library of magical artifacts, which actually kind of reminds me of Warehouse 13, which is a show, but
I haven't watched it.
Oh, you should, because it reminds me so much.
I would probably really enjoy it.
This duology, yeah. Okay, so
writing it down.
there are, I feel like you named off at least a handful of books that I read and I loved. And I thought I didn't read science fiction. So I think it's really interesting that science fiction is so much more. It's so much more than what I thought. But if someone hasn't read like anything, what are like some titles that are good, like kind of introductory titles? Like if someone's like, I read a bad science fiction book and now I hate that genre.
Right.
Shawna.
Yeah.
Changed my mind.
Like if somebody is not feeling science fiction, Blake Crouch would not be the first one that you're going to be like, read this,
No.
And be like, bye.
Like, I'm never coming to you for book recommendations again.
Right. Thanks, no thanks.
So if you really like the character development and that's important to you, then The Long Way to the Small Angry Planet would be a really good first sci-fi book, because it introduces all these different alien races and like how they interact with humans and just like what they do to interact with each other, and how the human race and all of them actually have really like had to grow to meet basic needs of each other so that they can communicate and get along. It's really interesting. I don't like, if you don't care about character development very much, or plot is like all you care about, that's not a good one to go with. There's very little plot in that one. The Hunger Games, of course, are like a fantastic one too. And I love that series also. I've read it a couple times. It's amazing. And Ready Player One is another really good first time, like approachable sci-fi, I think.
I'm excited. I feel like that one just bumped up on my list. On my
it's awesome.
to be read list. Yeah, because it's sitting there. Like I can see it right now. And I just have to commit. Am I reading it or am I listening? I don't know yet. Stay tuned.
I don't know. I listened to it, so I mean.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to hear some month in our bookish brief, Shawna will be like, I read it.
And hopefully it was great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I haven't read it either. I have not read
What?
Ready Player One. I know,
It was on the Book
which
of the
is
Month
funny.
options. That's where I got it from.
Oh, I think I saw it in
Like
there.
4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah.
And I had heard such good things about it. I was like, ooh, I'll get this one. It's got a really cool cover. You know what's funny though? I mean, this isn't a book, but I feel like I love The Matrix, and
Yeah.
but I don't
That's
think I
totally
could read
fine.
it. I couldn't read
Yeah, I don't
The
know how
Matrix
that
if
would
it was like a
translate to a book.
book series. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's just too much. But
A
watching
lot of
it,
visual.
yeah. But I'm like, oh, if they wrote that, I don't know. I don't even think I could read the script, like, of the movie. But it's funny
Right.
that there's a lot of science fiction movies that I love where, like, the books I would not touch
Hmm.
at all if they were
You more of
books.
a visual learner?
What's that?
You more of a visual learner?
Oh, absolutely.
That probably has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Or it's like I can kind of project what that would look like
Yeah.
in a movie, and you can't do that in a book.
Right, which is also why, and we talked about this on another podcast, it's even hard for me to listen to audiobooks because there's nothing that I'm looking at. And so I end up looking at everything else that's going around in the world, and I'm like, oh, wait, I think somebody died. Oh, now I have to, like, rewind. And then I rewind, and I'm like, I don't remember any of this. Like, how far do I have to rewind? So when people say, oh, you can listen to audiobooks, like, while driving and doing the laundry and doing the dishes, I'm like, no, you can't. I have to sit there in my chair and close my eyes and, like, really try to visualize what's going on. It's really hard for me to listen to audiobooks.
Yeah.
I think I was
I
not
don't
an
think I'd be able to
audiobook.
do that.
What, Liz?
I was not an audiobook listener. And Camille's actually who got me to listen to audiobooks, and
Didn't
she
know
had made
that.
the suggestion. Yeah. Well, because I was like, you were reading so much more than I was, and I was really jealous of how much you were getting read. And it's because you were listening and you had like that chunk of time during your commute. And I was like, okay, I need to listen. And you made this suggestion to listen to something I had already read, because I think I had told you, I was like, I feel like I can't follow the whole story. Like, I miss things. I miss chunks.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember what the first audiobook was that I listened to, but I listened to something that I had read already, and I was like, oh, wait, I kind of but I'm an auditory learner, and so it makes sense that I would like to listen. Like, even when I read books, like if I'm at home alone, I will read my book aloud to myself.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I do
Yeah.
like doing that, though, because I like doing voices.
Yeah. Well, and it makes it slow going.
It
like,
does.
It's slow to read, because I don't ever listen to an audiobook on just like one speed. I always listen to it at like 1.5, because it's slow listening to someone read aloud.
Well, that was one of the things that I just kind of learned. If I listen to it on 2.0, I got it. Because I'm like, oh, I gotta really listen to this. Like, I can't take a nap during this. So, like, it was actually A Handmaid's Tale. I listened to it I listened to the first chapter at regular speed so I can establish the flow. And then I bump it up to 2.0, and I'm like, ah. Like, I could tell you everything about it. Because it was like I had no time to, like, zone out. I don't know.
I can see that. I can totally see what you're saying, that there's no time to be distracted.
Mm-mm.
Wow. I don't
We
think
digress.
I've ever listened to anything on 2.0. I'm like, I can't even listen that fast.
When
My brain doesn't
like,
process like that.
when I'm done with the book, I'm like, I don't even care how this ends anymore.
You're
But
like
I feel like I
5.0.
need to, right. I feel like I need to read the rest of it. Like, I need to finish this, but I just don't care anymore. I will, whatever is the absolute fastest you can listen on Audible, that's what I'll listen to it on. Because I'm like, I want to get to the end. Like, I'm somewhat interested in what happens, but at the same time, I'm not interested at all in how they get there.
Mm-hmm.
terrible. It's terrible.
That's so funny. All right, so what matters most to you when you're reading? Would it be character, plots, world building? What's your, or put those in
So
order.
when I originally read that question, I was like, world building all the way. And then I thought about it a lot more. And so you can probably tell from my answers previously,
Characters.
character development, definitely. Um, and it's just because like they really have to drive the plot and they have to be interesting and engaging and they can't have like these shallow, stupid interactions. And otherwise I'm like, nope, I'm done. I don't care. Just like with Mila 2.0, I'm like, nope. Like not for me. Um, so it's definitely character development, then world building, because I really like that piece of it. And I think that's like part of how you develop the plot too. And how you get your characters to develop is by you generally have that like novice in this new world and like kind of introducing them to it. To use the Matrix as an example, like he's a newbie to it, right? So they're explaining how things work because you're also explaining it to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big part of why I love it. Because I'm like, oh, what do other people think other worlds look like? This is very interesting, which is probably why I love sci-fi so much. And then plot. Like I could read a book entirely on character development and be totally fine. Like if it had like a remote plot where I'm like, I kind of care about that, but not as much as I care about these people.
Right. I love it. I love it. I think that I always feel surprised when someone's like, oh yeah, plot is my favorite. And for a lot of people, plot is their favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, because in my mind, I'm like, how could plot be your favorite? Because I'm the same way. Like characters are here and then like world development's here and then plot is like down here.
Like you can't even see it, it's off the screen.
like it's like barely peeking out from the bottom. Because I've definitely read books that have had almost no plot. And I can see that for some readers, they would be like, this is terrible. But if you are a plot-driven reader, Mila 2.0 was probably a great book for you. Well, and I think like for Camille, because she and I talk about books a lot, if a book could have phenomenal characters, but if the world building is like non-existent, she's not going to like it.
Red Queen.
Right. So I wasn't going to say it, but now that you said it.
You already outed me for like Ender's Game.
Right.
So might as well do it the other way.
There's a book I love called The Red Queen, and the first one was phenomenal. And the series kind of goes downhill, but we don't have to go there. But it has really strong characters, and it actually has a pretty strong plot. But it has almost no world development, but it's a fantasy world. And so, like, I understand very much wanting to know how, like, the magical parts of the world work, but the author's not interested in telling you that. And so I think that you can definitely go back and forth because for me, it's like, it's characters. It's end all be all for characters. So it could be like a beautifully described world, but the characters could be weak, or it could just be told in the I voice, and I'd be like, meh, I'm not interested.
Not for me.
This isn't mine. This isn't mine. So we probably covered it even just now, but what is the one thing you can't stand when you're reading?
But so even if the characters are kind of shallow, like I'm okay with that as long as like the interactions between characters aren't so forced. So one I'm thinking of specifically is Under the Never Sky. And like I thought that like the world was very interesting, the characters by themselves were interesting, but when they interacted together, I'm like, this is like the most terrible dialogue I've ever read in my life. This is awful. And it's just, there's supposed to be like this romance building between these two main characters. And I'm like, nope, not feeling it. It's just so disingenuous that I just don't, like, I don't care. Like, please, can we skip over this part? So it's probably like that. I mean, it has to be like a fully fleshed out character, including how they interact with other people.
Well, I feel like I had no idea that I was reading science fiction. But after you were saying, you're like, well, there's a lot of crossover between science fiction and fantasy. I was like, oh. I feel like I've learned so much because I pretty much only read fantasy. I'm looking around actually at my books that are like stacked here on the table, and I'm like, I don't even see a book that isn't fantasy right now, except for the Enneagram book that I'm reading. Like,
and that's not even fiction, right? So
that's not fiction. So I think that's so interesting, and just that there are so many options in the science fiction realm, because yeah, that one thing that I like space travel, I'm like, I don't want to read about that.
Fair. Yeah.
And so yeah, no, I feel so enlightened. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
I want to challenge our listeners. If you are listening and you are a die-hard space alien robots are taking over the world type sci-fi reader, please let us know, and please come on our podcast so that you can enlighten us or explain what it is that you love about these books.
Well, I have a lot of books now that I have to add to my TBR. One of them being Ready Player One, because I'm not even sure it's on my TBR, and I feel like left out right now. I know.
You should. You should.
Maybe we should all read it together.
Yes, I would reread it.
Let's finish Outlander first.
Right.
Like, hang on. Chill out.
One at a time.
Right. I know. There's just so many good ones. See, we have to do like a reread. 2020 is the year of the reread.
Oh.
Let's make it happen.
I'm on board for that. Totally.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I loved having you, and for just telling us so much about science fiction and all the exciting subgenres there are.
Yeah, I love it because Liz and I would never have talked this much in depth over sci-fi because we just don't. And so it's so nice to have you as a guest and open that up for our listeners who do like sci-fi. And I think we learned a couple things that we do read sci-fi. So I'm excited to kind of look at my books again, because you listed 13 subgenres.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I like that.
I do have all of Camille's notes, so all of her fantastic book recommendations and the subgenres for science fiction will all be in the podcast notes on our website, which is gettingbookish.com.
Camille, thank you so much. It was a pleasure meeting you and putting a face to everything Liz just talks about you all the time. So it was really fun to meet you. So we hope that you come back and listen and join us, and we will talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye.